good visual novel protagonist is a lot easier said than done. Because the story is told from their perspective, the player is exposed to their thought process and views the world from their perspective. They must react in a way that feels natural, so that the player doesn't feel too divorced from their POV. It's a tricky balance. There are good protagonists, there are bad protagonists. Perhaps the greatest of all, at least for his own franchise, is Hajime Hinata. Is Hajime Danganronpa's best character? It's possible. He's certainly one of the most important, if not just for his place in the lore, but also for the message his arc development conveys. Is he my favorite Danganronpa character? Maybe, but he's up against some steep competition. But I am firm in my belief that he is the best protagonist in the series. He's relatable, well-developed, compelling, and is generally more involved in the plot than his predecessor or successors. His real strengths lie in 4 categories: his backstory, his personality, his reactions to the events of the Killing School trip, his interactions with the rest of Class 77B. Let's start out with the most obvious thing. Hajime is literally just some guy. He was a student in the reserve course, meaning he has no ultimate talent to speak of. Sonia even comments that his face is unassuming. The other 2 main protagonists in the series also claim to be ordinary people, but that argument falls apart under scrutiny. Makoto is pretty normal, but he does have uncanny luck, even if it's not as reliable as Nagito's. His unfailing optimism and trust in others also sets him apart. Shuichi says he's nothing special, but you still solved the murder case, dude, even if it was by accident. Komaru is normal too, and she's also an excellent protagonist, but there are some things that hold her back. Anyway, Hajime dreamed of attending Hope's Peak in a desperate attempt to prove himself as more than just normal. I think that's something we all go through, the desire to be someone important, a force much larger than the majority of people will ever turn out to be. We want to be special, we want to succeed, but most of us live very mundane lives that don't impact the world. And the thing is, Hajime is promised that he could be someone important. The steering committee manipulates Hajime into joining the Kamakura Project. And joining the Kamakura Project has drastic repercussions. I like to call it the most extreme version of the success versus sense of self arguments. What's that? Well, you ever get told to do something that feels like it's betraying your own personal code, but if you do it, you'll get more than if you stuck with your gut. It's a problem creative types in particular face. Do I make content I know is popular at the expense of my vision, or do I stick to making stuff I enjoy and hope it finds an audience? There are pros and cons to each side. Hajime, completely unwillingly mind you, chose success. He had no clue that he would be erased in exchange for talent. And all of this is before the events of the Killing School trip. Once that happens... If there's one thing the Danganronpa fandom gets consistently wrong, it's Hajime's personality. Well, no, they don't necessarily get it wrong. Rather, they just focus on a couple of minor but memorable traits. Like, walk up to the average DR fan and ask them what Hajime's personality is. You'll probably hear something like, "Oh, he's a tsundere!" And kind of? He definitely has tsundere-ish elements to himself, especially in his free time events. But the only outwardly tsundere moment I can think of is this one.
Huh? What happened?
I didn't come here to talk to you. I just came to bring you some food. So come on, eat it.
You're not going to feed me?
What do you mean?
While Hajime is overall standoffish, he does care deeply for his classmates and does his best to work with them. Granted, this doesn't always work. He has a bit of a temper and a short fuse, which results in him being brash and sometimes insensitive. But he's openly kind and an excellent listener. Fuyuhiko and Nagito even suggest he might be the ultimate counselor. The other personality trait the fandom has latched onto is his supposed inferiority complex. I'll be honest, I was one of those people for a while. But upon further analysis, I found it's more of a sliding scale of superiority to inferiority. He starts the game believing himself to be an ultimate, and as such, feels almost entitled to better treatment. He clearly has a talent, so why is all this bad shit happening to him? Hajime feels like he's on top of the world and everyone is trying to bring him down. And then the other shoe drops and he finds out he's a reserve corps student. That superiority immediately falls apart and he's back to feeling insecure and out of place. He's not an ultimate, so why is he even here? In both cases, he wants nothing to do with the situation. his first instinct is to run and avoid facing the problem directly. It's why he signed on to the Kamakura project. And his sense of entitlement isn't even odd. That's just how teenagers act. Hell, I'm a grown adult and I have the same feeling. Let's put it another way. Hajime has busted his ass all his life to find a talent and become more than ordinary. Meanwhile, a fourth of his class were born with their talents. They didn't train them, they didn't discover them after years of hard work. They were brought into the world and already special. It's like, I don't know, a guy from a rich family saying he got started off a small loan of $1 million. There's an underlying sense of bitterness in his interactions with the cast, and more on that later. One thing the fandom does agree on, however, is that Hajime is a sarcastic little shit. I know, we all like to make jokes about he's the only protagonist to say fuck, but it really does make the scene more impactful. Feels like, dare I say, how an actual human being would react. Another thing to mention, and I only realized this after reading Strep Silking's post, is that Hajime is kind of a drama queen. Like, reciting poetry at the night sky, posing like this during the closing arguments. Sure, he's cynical and pessimistic, but he's not as bad as Shuichi. He's kind and patient at times and feels strongly but isn't sure how to express his emotion. Gee, that's almost like how a real, normal human teenager might act. When you have a personality as complex as Hajime's, you tend to react in certain ways, even in the most insane of situations. This is probably my favorite thing about Hajime. He reacts how you'd expect a normal person to in the situations he's put into. Makoto has his whole, oh, these strangers I don't know won't kill anybody. See, this girl I knew years ago, trust me. How did that work out for ya, huh? Kaede also thinks that murder could happen, but the narrative is skewed towards her focus on killing the mastermind, making it almost redundant. Hajime, though, he immediately goes on the defensive and assumes the worst. Monokuma's like, oh, y'all gotta fucking kill each other. And he says, fuck this, I don't know these people and what they're capable of. If someone's dying, it's not gonna be me. And it makes sense. Class 77B has some of the most dangerous students in any Danganronpa cast upon further examination. We have a Yakuza, a guy who calls himself the Overlord of Ice. This girl wants to punch everything in sight, and a literal hut woman. Hyoko looks cute, but Hajime meets her while she's squashing ants. At least this guy is no, he's absolutely demented. As soon as he goes back to his college after the killing game reveal, he screams into his pillow until he passes out. But Hajime's gut reaction in most situations is to run. Even before the killing game, back when he was just a reserve corps student, he ran from a normal but perfectly safe life with Chiaki to whatever the steering committee had planned for him. He does his best to not get involved with his classmates, often bailing when things get too heavy for him. Hell, he walks out on Nagito in his free time events. And when he's faced with a sadistic choice at the end of the game, he completely shuts down. He retreats in on himself and refuses to address the issue. It's only after some soul-searching and a pep talk from Chiaki that he's able to finally accept his actions and choose for himself. Hajime Hinata, human embodiment of fuck this shit, I'm out. It's also worth noting that Hajime often plays the straight man to his classmates, even more than Makoto or Shuichi. He's the first to question why they act like they do. And it works! You've got people like Sonia and Chiaki who are comparatively pretty stable and normal. Then there's people like Nagito, Mika, Nekomaru, Ibuki, Kazuichi. He's not in awe of them like other protags, he's just confused, which I feel mirrors the player's reaction. It's a sense of realism that the Danganronpa series lacks elsewhere, and in my opinion, desperately needs for maximum impact. Also, his first thought when being asked what people keep under their beds is dirty magazines, and he calls Junko an insane bitch. You drop this king. Before we get into Hajime's relationships, I wanted to finally bring up Komaru and what I think her weakest point is. Due to how UDG is formatted, the only character Komaru ends up bonding with in any meaningful way is Toko. And don't get me wrong, their relationship is amazing even if you don't ship them. But there are few opportunities for them to develop beyond story events due to the lack of FTEs. Any relationship she might have built elsewhere in the game are soured by the other party's death or presumed death, or vanishing from the narrative afterwards. I guess you could say she still gets along with Nagisa, but that's more of a professional relationship than anything. I also don't count her bond with Makoto since that was present well before the game by virtue of being siblings. Again, I really love Komaru and I think she's up there. But that one aspect holds her back from being first. Okay, tangent over, back to Hajime. We've already established that, despite his prickly exterior and impatience at times, Hajime deeply cares for his classmates and wants them to be happy. I think that's best exemplified in his free time events with Peko. By the end, it's fairly obvious that Hajime has a crush on her. However, she confides in him that she has feelings for another person, heavily implied to be Fuyuhiko. Peko sees Hajime a friend, a dear friend, but still. When Hajime is disappointed in this, he ultimately tells her she should be honest about her feelings and agrees to remain platonic. Something another character from Danganronpa 2 could stand to learn, but that's another video entirely. But yeah, as a whole, I tend to forget DR2's FTEs more than remember them. But the ones I do remember are excellent and really emphasize Hajime's kindness. I don't think your normal, average person would be as willing to be as tolerant of Hiyoko as he is. Kind of ironic in some way, I don't know, don't at me. But it's also believable that Nagito's FTEs would be locked away unless you actively pursued them before the first class trial. After that point, Hajime would have no reason to try to hang out with a crazed madman, and the game reflects that. It also adds a layer of separation between the player and Hajime, which makes him feel more like his own entity. Maybe I'm alone in that, but I really like when games do that kind of thing. Hajime is also notable for having the only FTE that focuses on his own problems rather than the other character. Well, I guess Kaede and Shuichi had this too, but it was only when the other was playable. Ibuki is extremely comfortable with herself, even if she acknowledges she's outlandish. She might have a few insecurities, but is overall pretty well adjusted, especially compared to some of her other peers. So instead of tackling her few self-doubts, she instead spends her FTEs boosting Hajime and working through his issues. It's amazing that the game addresses this in such a way. Honestly, it's refreshing. It adds to Hajime's humanness and gives Ibuki another layer of depth. But that's just in the free time events. Going through the plot proper and ignoring all the FTEs, Hajime really only builds a meaningful bond with Chiaki. You could argue he ends up close with Fuyuhiko and Kazuichi, but that's really only expanded upon in the FTEs. Chiaki, on the other hand, is always by Hajime's side, and the thought of losing his memory of her is one of the main reasons he breaks down in the 6th trial. It's a bigger trigger for him than his own identity being erased. It's not a stretch to say Chiaki is his only friend. Hell, his backstory confirms that the original Chiaki was his first friend. That may seem strange, but given what we know about his personality, yeah, he would probably only get along with a few people.
You've got that wrong, Hinata-kun.
So I realized I neglected to talk about how Hajime is... He doesn't necessarily need to be carried into trials like Shuichi and Makoto do. See, he still gets help from Nagito and Chiaki at several points, but for the most part, he has enough sway and intelligence that he's able to mostly figure things out on his own. He doesn't necessarily rely on them. Now, granted, this does lead to some awkward and idiotic moments, but he doesn't have to rely on Chiaki to give him the motivation to actually convict the other students, and he doesn't have to rely on Nagito to figure everything out for him. Sort of like how, Makoto has to rely on Kyoko to figure stuff out, and Shuichi needs Kaito to motivate him. And I think that really does help his character, the fact that he is able to, solve these things on his own. He's also a rare example of a villain protagonist that's, both a plot twist and also a subversion. Because, people seem to forget that Izuru is technically the mastermind. But at the same time, the reason he brought Junko into the Neo World program is to defeat her once and for all. And Izuru is almost his own entity from Hajime. He's, in my opinion, probably the least interesting thing about Hajime. The fact that, he's also Izuru. And it's not dissing Izuru or his backstory, it's just... there's so much more to him that Izuru as a character just doesn't really factor into Hajime for me. It's technically a villain protagonist, and it's a good twist, and I know a lot of people really like that, but it's also a subversion and sort of almost an inversion of the villain protagonist. The hero antagonist, almost, if that makes any sense. It probably doesn't. I'm recording this at 11 p.m. and I have not slept in 3 days. Hajime, depending on the kanji used to spell it, can mean beginning or to cut. That makes sense, seeing as Hajime's birthday is January 1st, and he's also the first protag to use the rebuttal showdown mechanic. Also, his existence was ended with a cut. According to series creator Kodaka, another rating of his full name is Kamakura. Hajime is the tallest protagonist in the series and among the tallest of the DR2 cast. It also has one of the largest busts, tied with Akane. I know, we all poke fun of his chest, myself included, but seriously, it's starting to get old at this point. And speaking of getting old, if a single person mentions anything to do with limbless Hajime, it's on sight! I absolutely adore Johnny Young Bosch's performance as Hajime. Like, there's no doubt he would kill it, but I don't think any of us expected him to nail it the way he did. The absolute desperation and denial in his voice at the very end, the fear when he yells to be left alone, gives me chills every time. It is able to voice Izuru in a way that makes it sound like Hajime, but also a completely different person. Hajime's smile is literally the cutest thing. He doesn't smile often, but when he does, Did you know that in an official poll in Japan, Hajime is only ranked 6th best character? I can understand being beneath Chiaki, Nagito, and even Ibuki, but Hiyoko? That doesn't make sense. Until you remember that Japanese culture is very focused on what's best for the whole rather than the self. Hiyoko, according to her backstory, gave up a lot to continue her family's legacy. Hajime, on the other hand, threw away everything in order to improve his own life at the potential expense of others. I guess that's why Hajime is better received over here. I love Hajime's character design. So basic, but it ends up standing out. I did some checking. He's the only male character in any of the games that have short sleeves. There are a few female characters with short sleeves, mostly other characters in DR2, but he's the only guy. Another bit of foreshadowing to how he doesn't fit in? I don't know, it's interesting to know. Okay, enough rambling. Is Hajime your favorite protagonist? Why or why not? I'd love to hear your opinions down in the comments. I've also included a few threads and posts in the description that I used as reference or just think are interesting and emphasize some of the points I've made. If you enjoy what I do, please consider subscribing and following me on social media. I also have a Ko-Fi account if you'd like to support me monetarily. Until next time, toodles from Noodles. Bye-bye.